is sustained adaptability and what problems does it solve?
So today technologies change and they keep changing. And people adapt to take advantage of those technologies and what they afford them to serve their purposes. We call this systems that serve human purposes. Yes, they're very technological, automated, more capabilities all the time. And we see cycles and we see patterns in the cycles as these technologies change. One of the patterns is complexity. Right? These systems have creeping complexity, and that means there's more and more interdependencies, a greater web of interconnections, powered today by digital technologies, the web itself, web services and operations. And this connects systems together in new ways, which is great in many respects, but it also creates new problems. So today, failure is due to brittle systems, but we still try to analyze them as if it's a component failure, usually a human. It was human error. No, that's a component level analysis missing, all right, how a complex and adaptive system behaves. There are basic rules about how complex and adaptive systems behave, and when we violate those rules, we get surprises. Brittle systems that fail unexpectedly. Successes that start out great, but have offsetting losses and new problems that we didn't anticipate and are underprepared to deal with. So what we do is we study different situations. We go out in the real world, working with real organizations and real people who do difficult tasks under pressure with lots of technology or enabled by technological advances. And we try to understand the difference between when they're resilient and adaptable versus when they're brittle and break down.
And what signs would one look for to indicate whether or not a system has achieved the ability to sustain adaptability?
So, so there's two properties we're looking for. So we're starting out with how do we overcome brittleness? So what does brittleness mean? So descriptively, brittleness means that we have a rapid fall off in performance when we're at the boundaries, when events challenge our boundaries. And the idea simply is that any system, any technology, any organization you set up has finite resources and has boundaries. All right? It does some things well, and eventually there's some events and situations it doesn't handle very well. So that's we talk about events near, at, or beyond the boundaries. And those are surprises. And the question is, what do you do when you face a surprise? Are you able to gracefully extend performance and stretch your capabilities and add adaptive capacity in order to continue to perform effectively? Notice graceful extensibility is similar to a concept most people are familiar with of graceful degradation. And in web ops and in many situations where we need good reliability and robustness, we have all kinds of mechanisms we put in to get more graceful degradation. Well, people gracefully degrade, but it's harder to get equipment and technology to gracefully degrade. But what we're looking for here is a more powerful capability that we study in many situations. We look at places where people tangibly experience surprise. Space mission operations was one great example when we had the space shuttle. Right? Surprises were normal in a space shuttle mission. And so mission control involved ways to gracefully extend performance in the face of anomalies that would occur during a shuttle mission. They called in expertise. They activated new analyses. They had ways to cross-check the diagnosis in order to better replan. Because in that case, once you started the space shuttle back, you had better have a good plan because there's no going around and doing it again. Right? So they had a high incentive to make sure they had thought through all the different angles. So they were a great laboratory for us to understand what was the difference between being brittle and what were the critical ingredients to having graceful extensibility. Now, so graceful extensibility is one thing we can understand and look for. Sustained adaptability goes further. Not just that you can work out a good way to handle the surprises you deal with today, but that you can continue to evolve and deal with future kinds of surprises as your network, as your capabilities and resources change over time. Right? NASA also demonstrated this, or actually the failure to do this. So this is how the field of resilience engineering got started, was in 1999, NASA had a series of space exploration accidents. And we got together a group of people in 2000 to explore ways to overcome brittleness. The diagnosis wasn't simply a component failure, but they had the systems level diagnosis that it was too brittle. And how did it get brittle? By becoming more optimal. Oh, wait a minute, look at that puzzle. The pursuit of optimality, and in those days NASA called it faster, better, cheaper. And so that's the name that stuck. Under the pressure to get more optimal, or faster, better, cheaper pressure, all right, you start seeing all these sources that give you graceful extensibility and sustained adaptability as inefficiencies, and you start to cut them, and you cut them. And the people who do this get rewarded because they're good managers. They're getting things more productive. They're turning around things faster. All right, they're being more efficient. They're meeting financial goals. And so they look like they're doing a great job, but it turns out they're eroding the basis, right, to be resilient in the face of surprise in either the way of graceful extensibility or the longer-term sustained adaptability. So the question NASA posed was, how do we get these properties? What are these new properties, right? How do we know what they are? How do we know how to get them and build them in? Well, unfortunately, NASA didn't act on its own program because in 2003 we had the Columbia Space Shuttle accident. And the same diagnosis happened. I got to help advise a little bit to the Columbia Accident Investigation Board. And the lead up to that launch had many of the same problems. Faster, better, cheaper pressure, emphasizing throughput, turnaround, people discounting signs of trouble ahead, bottlenecks ahead, indications of new risks, right? The foam coming off the booster rocket, striking much more energy than they had predicted, 100 times more energy when it struck the orbiter, striking it in a place they hadn't analyzed as well, right? And striking it during a phase of operation that they hadn't been concerned about debris strikes. So they were playing down this new class of debris strikes, new energy levels, as if everything was the same, when in fact they were operating outside their boundary. They were in an unknown regime, and they didn't stop and say, wait a minute, we need to figure out what goes on in this out beyond the boundary. So they had a failure of graceful extensibility, and it happened late, and it cost people lives. Right? Our job in graceful extensibility is to create foresight, to anticipate things ahead, the changing shape of risk, so that we can adapt before harm occurs.
And so, are there techniques that teams can use from the outset to better their chances of success?
Well, yeah, but there's a kind of flip side. So we talked about examples where things go wrong. We heard about it in the conference already with the experience with healthcare.gov and its launch going so badly. But the other side of sustained adaptability is success. All right? We can think of it as, wait a minute, brittleness and failure, but success changes the network. Success changes. People take advantage of new capabilities and use it in new ways to do new things, to achieve new goals. So they end up doing things more complexly with higher workload and intensity. And I usually show a nice cartoon to illustrate these changing things, right? Automation 20, 30, 40 years ago was supposed to make our lives have more leisure, more opportunity to pursue higher level skills and intellectual activities. And instead, in today's Twitter, cell phone, 24/7 connectivity, what are we doing? We're working all the time, right? We now have to take a disconnected vacation to have a vacation. It's not enough to go somewhere. You have to leave your electronics behind. And so people took advantage of this and increased the pace. And so success actually challenges our ability to be resilient. It changes the kinds of risks that are out there, and we have to keep track of this. Sorry, I went off on that, and now I got to go back to your question.
That's okay.
Okay.
The techniques that people can use, teams can use from the outset to help better their chances of success.
So the way we make this work, right, and take advantage of this is to start to understand what happens at the boundaries. And we do this by studying organizations that confront those boundaries all the time. So they tangibly experience surprise. So we look at an emergency room. We looked at space shuttle mission control. We look at organizations where they operate in a world where they build schedules, but the change happens, bad weather, other factors that lead them to have to change their schedule rapidly. And so they have to replan and readapt very quickly to changing conditions. We look at extreme weather events, like the Icelandic volcano a couple years ago that was threatening, a different one was threatening a few weeks ago to spread an ash cloud over Europe and challenge the aviation system as to can planes fly, what's safe, what's not safe, how much do we have to scale back. And so when we look at those situations, we can find some of the properties. Well, turns out one of the properties is a tangible sense of precariousness, that no matter how good we've done before, no matter how successful we've been, the future could be different, and that we might not be well adapted. We might be precarious and fragile in the face of that new future. So that's a sense and awareness of precariousness rather than resting on the laurels of past success is really important. And we see this over and over again in many settings with many organizations. It's kind of a basic rule that tomorrow, the next cycle, the next quarter, the next year could be very different. For the internet world, I like to remind people that only 10 years ago, Facebook didn't exist. And now its headquarters is the old Sun Microsystems headquarters, which was a hot Silicon Valley company 25 years ago. So there's a sense and awareness, right? The internet press news, the tech press plays up how what startup is going to knock off what big boy. That was a startup that knocked off the last big boy. So one of the advantages in the internet world is that sense of precariousness, and that surprise can happen no matter how successful you've been in the past. The next big thing may change everything. Second, the surprise here is that the driver isn't technology, but people. Right? Why? Because people are a generic source of adaptive capacity. So when you have a shortfall, when brittleness starts to rear its head as complexity and networks grow and trying to get everything to connect becomes more and more difficult, who fills the gap? What fills the gap? People. Responsible people, right, are a generic source, a stopgap to fill the gaps. A story I like to tell is the military's use of drones in our recent escapades overseas. And drones were a new thing undergoing slow development, and all of a sudden, right, this technological capability met a pressing need, and it was pulled into service very rapidly. Right? But that was a fluorescence, need and capability. People grabbed that and used it. And then what happened is it didn't fit. It wasn't organized to fit the situation they needed it in, and so people filled the gap. Every drone was deployed took 170 people. It wasn't an autonomous system. 170 people were deployed with every drone. The Air Force didn't have enough people. Given the number of drones and missions, people needed that technology to fly. And they couldn't keep up with the human talent. And what did they do? People had to, we call them kludges. They had to kludge in and fill the gaps and stop gaps to make it work because it wasn't really an integrated system. And we see that over and over again. We start to think our system is more integrated and smooth than it really is. And we miss underneath that it takes people to intervene in various ways to fill the gaps. So the next step is, we call it being calibrated or miscalibrated. Do you have a good model of what does it take to make your system really work? Or do you start having this distant, miscalibrated view? Oh, it works smoothly, it works great, it's fabulous, just work to plan, work to roll, everything will be great. Why? Something went wrong, you didn't work to roll, follow the procedures more. Instead of looking and searching for what does people do to make it work. People create the effectiveness by filling the gaps and building bridges. How do they do that? Where do they do that? And if you study how people fill the gaps, how they are a generic source of adaptive capacity, you start to learn what you're missing, right? And you start to target what you can build on to be more effective in the future. So overcoming that miscalibration by looking for how people adapt to make the system work is critical.
So in the real world examples, we've talked about a few. What are the outstanding performers? Who's really doing this right? Okay.
Well, places, ironically, the theme that comes up across the board is you've got to decentralize initiative. You've got to push initiative down. Now, that initiative has to be coordinated with larger goals and priorities of the organization, but it's got to be pushed down to the point of action in the world. And we see this over and over again as a finding. So we look at successful organizations are flatter, or they know when to get flat. They get flat and they push an empower initiative close to the scene of action, because otherwise they'll be too stale. They'll be too slow to respond when things change. When they're at the boundaries, when surprise happens, they won't be able to keep pace with events, and events will cascade. So good organizations recognize the potential for cascades, and they set up a system to keep pace with those changes, right? And some of that is to invest resources to build initiative. Again, the surprise is it's a human system quality initiative, yet it comes up over and over again. And yet we see organizations, when they confront problems, go, well, if we just make people work to roll, we make them work to rule more, then everything will be fine, because we've got good rules and we've got a well set up set of roles. Just do your job and everything will work. And the answer is no. When things get fast-paced, when things start to cascade, when surprise happens, you need to adapt faster. Otherwise, you run into this failure called decompensation. You can't keep pace. You can't make decisions and deploy them to effect fast enough to keep up with change in the world. And we see this all over the place. So organizations that do that have initiative, and they anticipate bottlenecks and crunches ahead. They can understand when they're going to get crunched, and they adapt before the crunch happens. Those are the critical ingredients. Now we can come back and say, well, what kinds of organizations demonstrate those capabilities? The answer usually is some do some of the time. Some rarely do. Almost nobody does it all the time, right? Whether it's in military history, whether it's in emergency services, right? We find examples, and so that's why we're constantly studying that difference, that contrast between being able to adapt in the face of complexity, and when does that creeping complexity overwhelm you and you can't keep pace with change. And then in sustained adaptability, we're looking for those long-term signs of what's the organization doing that says, no matter what it did in the past, it's not going to handle the next surprise. Even though I can't tell you what that surprise will be, I can tell you it will be a surprise relative to how you work today, and do those larger properties, almost meta properties, of being able to anticipate, being able to proactively learn. Proactive learning means you don't wait for the big signal, the major event to occur that says, hey, learn, change, revise everything, a big thing happened. Because if you wait for a big thing to happen, it's usually bad, and the consequences are big and bad for the organization, its long-term financial, economic viability, and for its and sometimes for the safety of real people. So we try to find these organizations where we can contrast these things. And sometimes events like extreme weather is a great one. Extreme weather can act as a multiplier in that network of interconnections and interdependencies. And so you see organizations practice how an extrinsic event might take down a data center. And so they practice bringing a data center back. Now we have some organizations that don't even do that. So we have cases where you lose your digital infrastructure, say at a hospital, and you go to restore from backup, and then you discover you can't restore from backup. All right? That's a little scary when the patients rely on the medications that are all run through the computer now.
Sure.
And those events do happen. But we looked at organizations that started to prepare, and so they focused on a single data center outage. And then one of my students went and talked to them and said, wait a minute, if something really goes wrong, there are going to be cascading effects, and it won't be just one data center. Let's do a walkthrough of a scenario where multiple data centers go down. And what did they find? Their plan was pure fiction. Right? They relied on secondary resources that would also be affected by the external weather event. They didn't take into account how several different units might demand a resource and it'd be oversubscribed and fail, or lag in responsiveness. And all of a sudden, how quickly the total digital infrastructure could disappear. Now, if all your competitors lose it at the same time for the same duration, not a big deal. Everybody's hobbled the same degree. But if they are affected less and can restore capabilities faster, there's a huge economic advantage to being more resilient. And so we see a lot of business continuity centers just on long-term economic viability issues starting to invest in investigating and building resilience. It's not a one-time solution where you do one thing and we're done. Wrap it in a ribbon, file it away, a success. No, it's an ongoing, continuing investment in the recognition the world tomorrow could surprise you. And are you going to be prepared to respond?
Right, so it's more of a pursuit, a journey than an end goal. Okay.
Right, and right now we're in a journey of inquiry trying to understand the rules so that we can build in and help organizations continuously monitor, right, how they, what do they depend on to build graceful extensibility? Where do you put it? Because you just can't do it brute force. You can't just have a lot of extra resources, a lot of extra people, a lot of extra smarts, a lot of extra practice. That doesn't work. We have to be able to target what kind of resource gives you what kind of adaptive capability that's going to produce graceful extensibility given the way you live in the world today. What are the capabilities that are going to sustain adaptability over the long haul? It's not always implemented in the same way. Right? So we have to constantly be helping you understand and monitor that changing environment. And that's called an adaptive landscape. And so we're starting to develop charting tools like we're used to, charting a variety of things in our dashboards. Only what we're trying to represent now is an adaptive landscape where we understand the challenges and demands. We can understand something about the shape of surprise. Like in that NASA example, we could tell you something about surprise. When an event happens that's so atypical, right? You go, wait a minute, that's a surprise. We investigate it, right? We run a surprise down. That was the culture of NASA mission control. All surprises have to be run to ground. And so we understand, do we have to change? And maybe we don't have anything to change. But we don't assume everything is the same and we can move forward as before. We assume, right, we might have to change. And so we analyze each one. But that's a resource-intensive activity. So do we have enough of that capability? Can we deploy it in the right place? Can we deploy and mobilize the right resources? Deploy is more expensive, more prepared for things we can see something about the shape of surprise to come. Mobilizable are more related to where it's harder to know what surprise, but we know surprise will come in ways that challenge the way we work today. And so what can we mobilize to deal with that? And do we have the right capabilities to mobilize that? And that's where some of these principles like initiative come in. If we push initiative out of our system, we know we won't be able to mobilize and respond effectively to an unforeseen surprise.
Right, right. And shifting gears a little bit, you're leading a group at Ohio State called Complexity in Human, Natural, and Engineered Systems.
Yeah.
What is that group studying, and what are you hoping to find?
So the initiative crosses social, human systems, biological, the physical world, biology, and engineering, the technology world that we can design things. Because the field of inquiry into complexity and adaptive systems is really quite transdisciplinary. It's a new area that borrows from the control theory, cybernetics, and the two of the most recent Nobel Prizes in economics, one in 2009 from Elinor Ostrom, on how human social systems, a layered network of human social systems, are able to handle surprise, right, and not get trapped where at a narrow level everyone is behaving locally in a reasonable, adaptive way, but when you put them all together, it's completely maladaptive from a broader perspective of time or space and resources. And so we see this tragedy of the commons, where you're locally adaptive but globally maladaptive play out. Well, she got the Nobel Prize in 2009 for understanding that human systems actually sometimes make this work. They avoid that failure mode in adaptive system breakdown. How do they do that? And so she was an empiricist who got, and the first woman to get the Nobel Prize in economics. So a great milestone in several respects. In 2012, Al Roth got one, studying a particular setting and saying, how do you get a co-adaptive system to balance? right? And that's been applied to the kidney exchange program to build confidence and trust in a co-adaptive network that expands the ability to get kidney donors, to match kidney donors, and it expanded dozens and into the small hundreds of people who are alive today because of the expanded kidney exchange program. And that's all based on understanding how this tangled network of roles can be synchronized. And so those 2 Nobel Prizes tell us about how this can work. But notice, one's in microeconomics, one was in sociology. One of the big names is a control theorist from Caltech. You know, I come from studying how people, systems of people and computers make decisions. Many different disciplines. Some of the work is done in environmental systems. And so we have to pull these different threads of inquiry together. And of course, there's many things in academics that hobble that. Everybody's got to have their own labels, and everybody has their history of terms, and you know, my capital letter label's better than your capital letter label, right? Or, and pursue our careers. So trying to synchronize the inquiry across these different disciplines creates a huge language problem, and how to build up this foundation of how does the adaptive universe work? There are rules to the adaptive universe. We are starting to discover them. The lines of inquiry are really just starting to explode.
And your inquiries are just beginning now, correct?
Are just
beginning now?
Yeah, so we've been going a couple years, and this is a trend all over the world, to start to combine these different disciplines and try to synergize this inquiry into these rules of complexity and adaptation for systems. Tangled layered networks, all these nice evocative terms we like to use to get people to see the image of what we're trying to do. That the old linear simplifications don't work anymore. You can't just decompose a system into almost independent parts and say, you just work on this piece and you just work on that piece.
Right.
That's what we heard didn't work in healthcare.gov, right? The linear decomposition didn't work. So how do we synchronize and adapt is a new set of rules. And all over the world, we're seeing people try to integrate these different disciplines to come up with the new scientific basis, the new engineering basis, the new management tools that are necessary in order to make this work on a regular and predictable, stable basis. So that's what we're hoping to do at my university. But really, I'm trying to do this on a worldwide basis.
Right. And where can we see your research published?
Well, this kind of stuff now needs a new home. So some of this is in making use of new communication technologies to get it out through different media, such as this, and podcasts and conferences. We have our first professional association, the Resilience Engineering Association, and with biannual meetings. In the U.S., we've started a resilient infrastructure series of symposia. They tend to focus more on the resilience of digital infrastructures as well as physical energy infrastructures to try to address those issues. So we're trying to use all of the tools out there to communicate. The classic academic ones are probably lagging behind the most in terms of journals and how those things go. But we'll have a special issue in reliability engineering and system safety that are trying to pull this together, because people are used to publishing in their sort of home disciplines area, and you get a group of people. So how to tie this together requires us to adapt what we do and change what we were comfortable with. And sometimes that's hard. Ironically, for academics and university people, it may be the hardest for them to adapt.
Right. So, in general, what are you finding interesting these days? What people and projects are you tracking?
So what I'm trying to do is build a connection between the fundamental science and the engineering and management practices that real organizations can use. And right now, to do that, we're starting to identify some key things that give you the capacity to recognize bottlenecks ahead, recognize upcoming crunches. Even if you can't see the details of a crunch, that you can start to understand that you have to be prepared to handle them. And so what we focus on is this idea of cascades. And in a highly interconnected network, different levels, lots of interdependencies, things can spread and cascade in surprising ways and hidden ways. And how do you prepare to deal with that? So we're trying to identify from real organizations the tactics they use. We're trying to tie them to some fundamental science questions about how this works. and then apply that. And so the idea is called capacity for maneuver. Maneuver, right? It's active, it's dynamic. You always have a capacity for maneuver. Now, what defines that capacity for maneuver changes depending on the bottlenecks and obstacles and demands ahead. So you're constantly anticipating and looking at what's ahead. You're looking down the road. You're not looking right in front of your vehicle or at the tips of your skis in ski season. You're looking down the hill at what else is out there. You're looking down the road to see how things are changing ahead, right? And that anticipation helps us see about the potential for Cascade, helps us build the capacity for maneuver. And I think capacity for maneuver is a concept we can use at different scales. We can use it at individual small team scale. We can use it as an organizational or even industry sector-wise. What's the capacity for maneuver of European aviation when the next Icelandic volcano goes off? It was really low the last time.
Yeah.
All right, we hope it's better the next time, because I was stuck in it the last time.
Oh no. Well, thank you very much for talking with me today. It's been a pleasure.
Well, it's been wonderful. It's an exciting area, and the good news is, we live in the adaptive universe. We used to hide by adopting linear simplifications. Technology has grown so powerful, and we're so enamored of those possibilities and benefits that we can't hide behind those linear simplifications anymore. We have to learn the basic rules of the adaptive universe and put them into action.
Well, thank you very much.